Awesome. Hello, everyone. My name is Ethan Bresnahan. I'm a marketing manager here at CyberSaint. Welcome to today's webinar, ROC and SOC, Creating Risk Operation Centers to Support SOCs. Today, I'm joined by CyberSaint Senior Customer Advisor Haley Pruitt and Principal Solutions Architect Steve Torino. Before we go ahead and get started, this recording will be available on our Bright Talk channel following the presentation today. And please feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation. We'll also be adding some attachments to the webinar following the presentation. So, with that, just to kind of kick things off, we've seen a lot of activity in the last 12 months and kind of extending into this year, especially as it relates to risk. And with more and more business side leaders, especially boards, members of the C-suite, taking a greater interest in risk, we are starting to see this coalescence around the idea of a risk operations center to sort of complement a security operations center. So, to kind of kick things off a little bit more, Steve, could you cover for us the difference between a ROC and a SOC? In your opinion, what makes you think that they should be discrete functions?
Yeah, happy to do so. So I'm going to pull up a quick slide here. I always love a blue team versus red team exercise. So just kind of starting out here, though, a risk operations center or a ROC, it really is kind of a new concept, right? So if we take a look back at security operations centers and kind of the history there, going back, to the late 90s, everything's starting to come online. All this digital transformation stuff is starting to happen. And one of the challenges at that point was, we have users interacting with our systems. We need to understand, what they're doing, how they're doing it. And so industry responded with a whole bunch of different preventative controls, which are really noisy by design. And so in any given enterprise environment, you could have alerts and notifications coming off systems that number hundreds of thousands or even millions in a given day. And so how does a human being or how does a team deal with that volume of alerts? And so, to meet that challenge, then you started to see the emergence of technologies like SIMs and the Security Operations Center as the people who are leveraging that system, understanding by applying tuning, which particular events coming off your different preventative controls need to be looked at by a person, ultimately investigated and shut down, quickly if something bad is happening. Mm-hmm. So as we look at kind of the orientation of controls, different security controls, right? You can talk about ones that are a little more technically oriented, ones that are maybe physical security controls or management security controls, and I'd put the Security Operations Center in more of that technical control category. It's an impact minimizing or lowering technical control, which in some ways I think you could ascertain as kind of the result of a risk-aware culture, because if the organizations understood that we have certain risks, we're going to buy those down by deploying different preventative and detective technologies, but we also understand that is not a guarantee. There's still a likelihood that, or a chance anyway, that a motivated actor is going to be able to bypass those preventative technologies. And so that's where we need to focus on minimizing the impact. And that's really where the Security Operations Center comes in, right? So kind of the value there is in some ways not realized until something bad happens. You identify it really quickly and shut it down before it spreads too far. But in talking about it from the perspective of control orientation, I see a risk operations center as being more of a management control. So these days, as organizations are becoming more and more risk conscious all the time, it's at all different levels, from management and executive levels down. We're reporting on these things in our financial reports, our SEC documents, things like that. One of the things that's been lacking historically is this real-time visibility. And so in that sense, the concept of a risk operations center from a continuous monitoring perspective is similar, or has some similarities to a SOC. Another similarity is in the data sources that can be used by both teams. So where a security operations center is going to be looking at telemetry sources to identify indicators of compromise, risk teams may be able to use a lot of those same sources of telemetry, but looking at it from a different lens, like looking at it as how that's impacting risk versus just how it's being used to identify indicators of compromise. Mm-hmm. So in those couple of ways, I think there's some similarities. But the difference, I think, comes down to two main things. One is the audience of what's discovered by each of these teams, and the other is kind of the insights that are gleaned from them. So from a ROC perspective, you'd expect the audience of the output from a ROC to be more management leadership as they're trying to understand risk posture in real time and respond to that accordingly. So an example here, probably a bad example, but it's one that I'll give anyway, is let's say alerts that are coming off of a firewall that are demonstrating that there is an increase in activity that's coming from like an adversarial nation state. And I say that's a bad example because any hacker who knows what they're doing would obfuscate their location and make it seem like they're coming from the building next door. But from a SOC perspective, at some point, if the firewall is deployed correctly and the rules are up to date and it's blocking the attempts that are coming from this, adversarial place, it's doing its job. Like we'll let you know when something bad happens. Risk teams, though, might be interested just in the fact that we're seeing an increase in this. They might want to take that back to some of their information sharing groups, whether that's an ISAC or a sector coordinating council or just some other information sharing group they're part of, InfraGard, whatever, and understand if there's other organizations that share their profile that are experiencing similar things, which could then be rolled back up to management as intelligence to say, hey, do we want to be deploying any additional resources here? This is something that we're seeing, going on, and it's a little bit concerning potentially in the future. So those are, I think, a few of the differences. The other thing I would call out here as a difference between a ROC and a SOC is lately, with so much emphasis on third-party risk management, the question of where that lays in sort of the continuous monitoring of that and those relationships, I think a SOC, or I should say a ROC, is a really good sort of place to put that function, right? So a lot of times the risk that's coming from third-party relationships, there might be some indicators prior to something bad happening that the risks have increased. And so a ROC who's paying attention to these things, monitoring those type of sources around information about vendors, third-party technologies, et cetera, might be interested in monitoring these things a little bit more closely.
Very interesting. Yeah, I think some very good points and some very good distinctions there. I think you mentioned, you kind of talked especially about sort of getting that real-time visibility within a ROC as it relates to risk. And it sounds like a major point of differentiation, kind of going back to what we can call the sort of the allegorical example that you gave between a ROC and a SOC, is kind of that action versus analysis. Can you talk a little bit more about sort of how the analysis that's getting done by sort of the ROC that's focusing more so on that proactive approach serves other parts of the business sort of potentially beyond security? I know you kind of touched upon more so the audience being business side stakeholders. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So, frankly, the risk appetite and risk strategy are ultimately management responsibilities. The challenge that they have around real-time visibility really has to do with the fact that risk is so dynamic, right? So threats are changing constantly, vulnerabilities are constantly changing, value of assets and the data that are on those assets is constantly changing. So in some ways, once a risk assessment happens or is complete, it's kind of out of date. And leaders are really looking for more up-to-date sort of real-time or near real-time intelligence to kind of back up their decisions. And so I think from that perspective, the being able to glean that type of information to the powers that be within an organization so that they can take the diligence that they need and their due care of determining, what the appropriate risk appetite is going to be, whether certain risks are acceptable or whether we need to put actions in place to mitigate those or transfer them or even avoid them altogether. It's hard for them to do that without the intelligence. So, and I see a risk operations center as playing a critical role in providing that intel.
And so, especially given sort of the precipitous changes that we've seen over the course of the last, I'll say, at this point, probably going on 18 months, but more so sort of why now? We are sort of starting to see this coalescence around a centralized platform for risk. And I know we're going to kind of be diving into that with Haley in a little bit. What do you see as some of the driving forces that have led to the need for a standalone ROC?
Yeah, I think there's a few things to unpack there. So starting with just cyber's top of mind, right? No matter how you slice it, it's organizations are very aware of the risk that's posed there. We hear about it all the time in the news. There are financial consequences, reputational consequences. So everyone's very sort of hyper aware of cyber risk and trying to wrap their heads around it and understand, are we doing the best that we can do to prevent these things from happening or to minimize the impact if they do. And simultaneously, whenever we think of any type of continuous monitoring type of solution in IT security, typically, the SOC is the first place that you think about, because whether it's homegrown or whether you're contracting out to a SOC as a service or an MDR provider, they have the infrastructure set up to be monitoring things 24/7. And so I think everyone's mind kind of goes to that function first, but I think there are legitimate conversations happening around whether the SOC is the best place to house this function to be continuously monitoring risk. The other thing, though, and particularly for us at CyberSaint, is that up until recently, there's really been a lack of a system of record to enable this continuous risk monitoring. With a lot of the work that we're doing around continuous control monitoring by ingesting telemetry sources from throughout the security stack, associating that with controls, and then rolling control score up to risk, we're really providing this capability for organizations to gain that real-time visibility into their posture. And as we are continuing to have conversations around this and roll out more and more functionality, the question of the ability to continuously monitor it and have people available when needed to investigate further or to take some sort of action is conversations that we're definitely hearing about more frequently.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think great insight there, Steve. Shifting gears a little bit, Haley, having worked with many companies during sort of your consulting days, in a similar vein, can you tell us a little bit about sort of the current state of play as it relates to risk management and why you're seeing centralizing risk operations as such a critical role in sort of the future of digital business?
Yeah, so I think, if the last year has taught us anything, it's that disruptive risks like COVID-19, they're unpredictable. They're quick to unfold, they're changing constantly, and they have cascading impacts that span beyond a single functional area. So for example, with the pandemic, what may have started out as a location-based risk quickly escalated into a regulatory risk where you had the government mandating shutdowns, and then that transformed into a cybersecurity issue that had financial risks as the world tried to navigate, working from home. So while events like this may seem relatively new to us right now, and they may seem extreme, they're becoming commonplace. So we're seeing them increase in frequency and also in severity. And so with that, there's this additional push for the breakdown of traditional organizational silos in favor of a more centralized collaborative approach. Because what we're recognizing is that in order to respond effectively, there needs to be a centralized team who is collecting and making sense of data across the entire risk landscape on a continual basis. So this team needs to understand the interdependencies that exist between the different functional units and how, different risks and different risk actions might affect them differently. And those units will have the specialized knowledge and the expertise required to make enterprise-wide decisions, but no one unit has all of that expertise. So really it's about creating this seamless communication and collaboration between all of the different areas that are affected, and making sure that they're on the same page so that response is as effective as it can be. Gotcha.
And so, kind of diving a little bit more so into the anatomy of a ROC, if you will, sort of the core components, right? What do you see as sort of some of the necessary functions within a ROC? As for those kind of starting to think about how can I start assembling a risk operations center?
Yeah, so I'm going to bring up a slide here real quick. I think that it's likely to vary somewhat across organizations as they start to spin these up. But at their core, the ROC has kind of four main components. The first one being the risk intelligence monitoring post. So that's the part of the ROC that's continuously monitoring the risk landscape. It's collecting data and intelligence in real time against all of the risk types and categories that are relevant to the business. And then it's issuing alerts if there's a significant change in one of the risks that is being monitored, or if there's a significant risk event. So then, once you've generated this alert, now you have to decide who needs to be notified about this, which is where that next component, the workflow tool, comes into play. So the workflow tool can either be, kind of a GRC platform or an incident management system. It's something that routes the information that's been collected to the relevant people based off of the risk level or the risk type. So now, once you've notified the relevant people, now you have to decide what is it they're supposed to do. So that brings in that third component, which is the response center. So the response center is made up of multiple specialized work streams. These different work streams are going to work together to assess the risk intelligence that they've received and then decide what mitigation actions need to be taken by each of the different, business functions and also the external third parties. And so they're going to provide that guidance to them and tell them what they need to do. So after that, everyone knows what they're supposed to be doing, but the last step is actually doing that. And that's where that feedback loop comes in. So you have all of the business functions taking the mitigation actions that they've been told to do. They're tracking mitigation through to resolution, and then they're reporting back into the ROC on the effectiveness of the actions they've taken. That way, if there's something that's not really working, the ROC has the opportunity to kind of change up plans and adjust the mitigation actions as needed to make sure that things are effective.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I think that definitely, a lot, especially with the ROC being such a new concept, it helps to kind of contextualize sort of what this looks like. And to Steve's point, to the conversation or the points that Steve was making about sort of what separates a ROC from a SOC, right? And so from your experience working with a lot of different security and risk teams, what would you say is sort of the greatest impact of centralizing risk operations within a ROC? Are there any sort of examples that you can share in terms of sort of why centralizing risk operations is of value?
Yeah, so I think, from my experience working in wargaming, for any type of incident response, that's going to bring into play a bunch of different functional units. So you would have people from HR, communications, IT working together, but they don't necessarily speak the same language. There's always been that disconnect between, business and technology. And so, centralizing risk operations for me is this creation of a unified risk strategy that transcends the entire enterprise. It's one that encompasses people, processes, and tools. It's enabling those business units to, speak the same language and to, be pursuing the same goals. So collectively, they're responding to risks faster and more effectively. We're kind of shifting the focus away from risk identification towards mitigation, by having them use different tools that are at their disposal. So by centralizing, you're creating this risk-aware culture that not only incorporates cybersecurity, but is ingrained to each of the different business units. So it gives us greater visibility and insight into the company's overall posture, but also their posture and how it varies across the different units. So when you're bringing those together, it allows them to collaborate and to establish that common operating picture so that they can make better, more informed, data-driven decisions around, which risks the company should transfer, mitigate, or accept.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All good points. I think so. Kind of to bring the two halves together, right? As far as sort of what Steve covered and what you just covered, Haley. Steve covered a lot about how ROCs and SOCs are different. Question for both of you: how would you say that? And Haley just kind of talked about sort of the value of centralizing, sort of the cross-functional collaboration that can happen when you have a centralized organization like a ROC. Question for both of you: how would you say that these two different organizations, a ROC and a SOC, would benefit from each other as opposed to how they're different?
So for me, the way that I kind of break it down is that, the SOC is identifying threats, and then the ROC is dealing with the risk that results from those threats. So they're kind of two halves of the same puzzle. While one deals predominantly with technology, the other one's dealing mostly with the people and the processes surrounding that technology. So when a threat is identified, you have the SOC who's, putting out the fire. They're down in the weeds, they're in the technology, they're treating the symptoms. But the ROC takes kind of a step back, a higher level view, and is looking at the source behind the threat. So, they're looking more at which controls had to fail in order for that threat to actualize. And then they're able to, make adjustments across the enterprise to ensure it doesn't happen again. So in a sense, there's kind of like this symbiotic loop that the SOC and the ROC are a part of and how they affect each other's processes.
Gotcha.
Steve, any additional thoughts to kind of build off of that?
I totally agree. It's a symbiotic relationship for sure. Obviously, indicators of compromise that the SOC is identifying are really important to roll up to risk. But then at the same time, from a tactical perspective, I think having the visibility, kind of like from a risk assessment basis for the SOC as they're taking a look at the different assets in the environment. If it's already been identified that there are certain, maybe assets where we're lacking in some sort of controls that haven't been deployed yet, or for whatever reason, having that awareness while they're doing their job can be really important, because it can, apply more vigilance to certain assets or technologies or software, or whatever it may be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, starting to think about sort of this idea of a risk operations center, we at CyberSaint have definitely been kind of seeing this on the horizon for a little bit. Looking back, we've actually sort of seen the precursors of this start to appear in other places as well. In 2018, Paul Dwyer, a partner at IBM Security, postulated that SOCs are actually evolving into ROCs rather than sort of remaining as a separate entity. So for both of you, again, do you agree with Mr. Dwyer in that there needs to be only one organization, or does a SOC still serve a purpose once a ROC is established?
I can take that one first. So I don't know that I have a strong opinion about whether it needs to be one organization or two distinct organizations. But the thing that I would mention, at least in the current state where we're in today, we talk a lot about, the problem or the problems in cyber, and you can view that through different lenses. We have, certain systemic problems and certain economic problems and government or governance problems. But one that's really consistent throughout all of them is we have a people shortage. And what that results in is the fact that individuals with these skill sets become really highly compensated and really desirable in the marketplace. And so until we kind of solve the problem on a more systemic level of having more people available to do the job of a SOC analyst or a risk analyst, I do foresee if you start training all the SOC analysts to also be able to do risk analysis, you're setting yourself up for your competitors or other companies to just snatch them up. Because in any metropolitan area, if you start having, CISP and CISM certifications, you're a very, very, very valuable employee. So I think, to me, the systemic conversation that I'd be interested in having before figuring out, where in an org chart these functions are going to sit is what we're going to do to try to solve some of the talent shortage that exists today.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and I think to Steve's point, while I see that the SOC and the ROC have independent purposes and they require different skill sets, I think that there's maybe a potential opportunity for the SOC to become, one of those main components of the ROC, or, maybe a branch off of that risk intelligence monitoring post, because, at their core, they're both monitoring their environment. They're, looking for similar related things that are slightly different, but all part of the larger, bigger picture. So under this umbrella of, creating this more centralized function, the closer that these two organizations are working together, the more seamless and the more effective overall risk response is going to be.
That's interesting. And especially, Haley, you actually said something that kind of building off of that statement around the seamless handoff, right? That almost makes a case for that evolution there, right? From keeping it within one org and sort of having them be two sides of the same coin, rather than having it be two separate organizations. In that the handoff process might be easier with it when it's one organization with two different units.
Right, because the things that they're dealing with, they build on each other. And so when you're looking at it from a leadership perspective, when you have insights that are consolidated and you can step back and you can look at trends and really look at what's happening versus the nitty gritty, that's what enables you to make better decisions that impact the entire enterprise. So it's being able to see the full picture. And if you have, multiple disparate units that aren't working together, it's harder to build, that overall picture and see what's happening and what steps you need to do.
Yeah, we're trying to get away from silos.
Yep.
Yes, exactly. That's the dream. Well, I think that about wraps it up for my questions. Any parting thoughts from either of you two? I really appreciate the time. I think that you both had some really great insights to share here.
Oh yeah, thanks, Ethan. Great webinar, great topic, and look forward to chatting more about these important discussions.
Yeah, I'm excited to see how organizations start spinning these up and to see where they go in the future and kind of how COVID and quarantine affects all of that.
Yes, 100%. And for anyone watching, feel free to reach out to learn more sort of about how we at Cybersane are sort of enabling this transformation, sort of the adoption of the ROC, and info at cybersane.io. We'll be adding attachments to some resources around how to establish a risk operations center, why to establish a risk operations center below after the talk here today. And thank you both, Steve and Haley. This was great.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Ethan.
Thanks, everybody.